Let's try to go back to that earlier story. Russia's President Vladimir Putin, who will no longer be attending the BRICS Leaders Summit to be held in Johannesburg this month, or next month, in fact. That news came through a statement from the presidency today. For more on this, we're joined by the University of Pretoria's International Development Law Professor, Danny Bradlow. Professor Bradlow, a very good evening to you. Grateful for your time. So, Putin no longer coming. There were multiple delays. This decision had been pushed back on whether he would come or not. Ultimately, did South Africa have any other choice but to have this awkward conversation with the Kremlin?
I don't think they did. I think our law is clear. We know that from when the former president of Sudan came here in similar circumstances. And the international law is clear that if President Putin came, the South African government would have an obligation to arrest him. And I don't think President Putin was willing to run that risk.
And would it have been, where Putin is concerned, a decision taken because of the ICC warrant or because of domestic considerations? As we know, he's currently leading his military through the war on Ukraine at the moment. He's faced a challenge recently with Prigozhin, leader of the Wagner mercenary group. There were even reports that he'd met with him, and some have even said that this was the most daring challenge to his rule and that perhaps being out of the country so soon thereafter would have been a problem.
I think that Mr. Prigozhin gave President Putin a face-saving way out of this dilemma. It's clear there's some issues going on within the Russian government, and for him to leave the country now would certainly be creating a risk. And so that gave him the excuse. I don't know if he really had to stay in the country, but it gave him the excuse to tell us that he's not coming and to look like he's being cautious in regard to the situation at home.
But when the South African government says the decision was taken by mutual agreement, that suggests that there was discussion needed and that ultimately they then had to find common ground. And it brings into question why these discussions were left to this moment when the ICC warrant was issued weeks ago already.
I think it's a very good question as to why it's taken so long to resolve this. But I think it was probably always on the cards that President Putin was, in the end, not going to come. I think the statement today, President Ramaphosa deserves some credit for using his diplomatic skills to get President Putin to acknowledge the situation and to admit that he's not coming sooner rather than later. And that's better for us because it allows us to prepare for the BRICS Summit without having to worry anymore about who's going to represent Russia.
And with Lavrov, then, the foreign minister, now going to come in the place of President Putin, does that still give the same weight to Russia's representation at the summit at all?
Not as much as if President Putin was coming. To the best of my recollection, this will be the first time since the BRICS started holding summits that one of the leaders of the countries has not come to a summit. So in that sense, it's a big step. Mr. Lavrov obviously is an influential government official, but he's not the president. And so that lowers the standing of Russia in the negotiations. But on the other hand, I think everybody understands why President Putin's not coming, and they will therefore treat Mr. Lavrov with similar courtesy to the other leaders.
Mm. And I wonder if you think this decision will then bode well for the Africa Peace Mission, because President Ramaphosa and the other African heads of state had managed, in fact, in recent weeks, to visit both Russia and Ukraine. And if this will then reflect positively for the African heads of state in Kyiv.
It's clearly not a negative. It's a positive. Whether both sides, Ukraine and Russia, are actually willing to start making peace at this time is not very clear, and in some ways looks particularly unlikely. Unfortunately, the African leaders don't have many either carrots or sticks to use in negotiating with both sides, and so it's unlikely that they'll be able to do anything in the short run, other than perhaps persuade the Russians to go back on the grain and re-enter the grain deal that Turkey had brokered to allow grain and fertilizer to be exported from that region.
But do you really expect that the African Peace Mission will succeed in terms of bringing an end to a conflict that other negotiators so far have either been accused of taking sides or have completely failed. And does the BRICS Summit itself in South Africa next month present an opportunity then to pursue the African agenda to basically put an end to the bloodshed?
To be honest, I would be surprised if the African initiative turns out to be the one that makes peace in the region, just as I said, because I don't think Africa has a lot to bargain with and to compel both sides to bargain. On the other hand, the BRICS do have a fair amount of credibility and persuasive power with the Russians, particularly because of the fact that China is in the BRICS and India, which is a close trading partner of Russia, are in the group. Whether they will be seen as a neutral party by Ukraine and Ukraine be willing to negotiate, of course, is a separate issue and probably is less likely because Russia is part of the BRICS.
Thank you very much for speaking to us tonight, Professor Danny Bradlow.